Thanks for joining us again, everybody. Mike Suzzalo at Global Commodity Analytics with Zeus on Commodities. It's April 25th, 2026. We appreciate you joining us. It's interesting to note that here we are in 2026, but what is the opening night feature tonight at the movie theaters across the United States? Michael Jackson's biopic. Can you get any better than that for continuing on the 1980s mindset when it comes to our analysis and what we're talking about in international affairs and what we're talking about in the New East, New West, and what we've talked about on this blog throughout the course of the past 2 or 3 months? It's a neat time to be alive. It's a neat time to go back and look at research. One of the things that we're going to talk about is we're going to catch you up on what's happening in the Middle East, what's been going on with loss of oil and energy production. We're also, though, going to start with going back to where we left off last time and addressing some of the issues. And I'm going to try and button up a little bit better where we were when it came to the 1980s and what the new acronym that I introduced to you was, the new International Economic Order that was created essentially back in 1981 at the big meeting in Cancun, Mexico, between the big powers, trying to get a handle on and address some of the problems with the developing countries. And so even back then, we had this have not type mindset in terms of what the globalization process back then, which had not really ramped up as aggressively as it did after the Chinese joined the WTO in 2000, 2001. But we started the path of the Western liberal order of international economics, international foreign policy. And recall, and I got a new thing for you here. Tom and I go back and forth because Tom is close to 30, I'm close to 60. I grew up in an era where we had like vocabulary terms that we had to learn. Almost every day we'd walk in, we'd use chalkboards. Yes, that's right, I used chalkboards in the schools that I went to. But we had these vocabulary terms we had to learn. And so I can't get by with just putting up stuff. I have to have stuff already up on the board to kind of ease me into my comfort zone. So I'm introducing the new vocabulary list that we'll be looking at pretty much every time we get on this podcast. We got 5. I'm going to try and stick with 5 economic terms or 5 major terms on our vocabulary list. We've got economic interdependence. We've got morality. We've got beggar thy neighbor, we've got statecraft, and we've got liberalization. I'll tell you right up front, statecraft is the outlier in all of this. That's the one that doesn't fit. The other 4 fit with idealism versus the realist. And so let's get cracking on the NIEO mindset, that new international economic order mindset to help the developing world back in the 80s. We're still fighting that because we are still, as I've talked about before, fighting the realist mindset, trying to come back because we've had the idealist mindset that's been so prevalent in this time period ever since really the 1970s. So I'm going to start with that type of topic and try and button up where we've been here over the past 2 months or so. I'm going to start with a new book. This is George Weigel. He is a brain. That's all you can say about George Weigel. He was actually the official biographer of Saint Pope John Paul the Great, and he's got several books out, all of them phenomenal. I can't say I've read all the way through all of them, but I've got most of them and read a lot of them. But this guy in The Fragility of Order really states it nicely, and this kind of ties together almost everything that we've been talking about as far as the battle between realists and idealists. We can make it as complicated as we want. And as I said, with the vocabulary list, we'll talk about that. But this really goes to the heart of the question of the realist not being in power over the last 50 some years, the idealist being in power and creating the global economy as we know it, and China and the New East coming in, trying to, as powers that are not happy, reformist type powers, revisionist type powers, wanting to change the world order. This is not a new thing. This comes and goes in history all the time. In fact, Weigel says, for pretty much in the beginning of the book, The debate over morality in foreign policy is at least 2,400 years old. As we learn from reading the Melian dialogue from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, Machiavelli, these are the classical, like the old-time realist type mindset. And what we mean by realist is it's very simple. Realist really means statecraft. And statecraft really just means a sovereign nation cannot be put into a lower priority. And what the realists, and what I'm going to talk about to you today to try and finally turn the corner on our arc of analysis, is to say, and this is where we left off last time, was the sovereign nation, the statecraft that the realist has always thought should be at the top of the list. The idealist brought in their idealism, their technology advances that led to a global economic interdependence, led to a morality and a sentiment of what we should be doing in the world, and also led to a liberalism. So we're going to focus on those. The bigger thy neighbor I'll get to in a minute, because that's kind of summing up what happens economically. But we're going to stay in the political realm for right now and talk about that. Weigel goes on and says, and this is really important to the younger people out there listening. It's good for me too to remember, but it really puts in context what we're talking about with, give me an example, Mike. Give me a hardcore example that I can say, realist, idealist, realist, Teddy Roosevelt, idealist, Woodrow Wilson. Both of those right up against each other. That's what Weigel does so well in this little bit of context here. In the modern American context, the counting from the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, that debate has careened through at least 10 cycles. We're talking about the debate between morality and foreign policy. And what I'm tying together here today is morality is the idealist. But it's interesting, like we talked about last time, the morality of the idealist embraced the technology. The classical realist, and there's different types of realists, and we won't get in the weeds, but the classical realist is talking about statecraft, human nature, but he embraces and she embraces reason and science and backs up their philosophy of the realist mindset in how to deal with foreign policy based upon a nation state with rationality and reason. And I think that's a huge piece that we've forgotten, and this is why we're circling back around, and 1980s are so useful to us right now, because a lot of what I'm going to read to you in a minute from Gilpin's book is back from the 1980s, but it's going to sound like we've talked about before, a lot like what we're dealing with right now. And so finishing up with Weigel, the debate has careened through at least 10 cycles, and this is just the modern American time period, resulting in numerous and sometimes jarring shifts in the American approach to the world. The starting point for this to and fro coincided with the Great War, World War I, 1914-15, as the years from 1914 to 1920 witnessed the emergence, the peak, and the collapse of Wilsonian idealism. I think I mentioned this once before on the podcast. This is exactly what I heard in the early 1980s when I was in college in political science classes, learning about Hans Morgenthau and the realist, the modern classical, the classical idealist mindset at the time, which was the modern time period, but now it's even morphed even more in realism. And the Wilsonian idealism and internationalism, quite self-conscious in its moral assertiveness, which distinguished it from the robust realpolitik internationalism of Theodore Roosevelt. So I had a great question. My daughter's an economist, and she wrote me a question and said, is there a foreign policy that the United States is following? And I think this is a very timely time period to take up that question. And I think what she meant by that is, if there is, what's the stated goals? Because it seems like we're moving and weaving and bobbing all over the place right now. And I think that what we can say pretty clearly is that President Trump has two models for his foreign policy. We've talked about President Reagan before. We've talked about what's been going on in Latin America, Venezuela, Iran in the 1980s, the blockade, the naval blockade. Again, we're really hitting it with the news that's been happening and what we've been talking about and maybe predicting and trying to push out there a little bit and saying, this is what's probably going to happen if this doesn't happen. And so we've had a naval blockade in place. That's what President Reagan did to Iran after the Iran-Iraq war in order to get the mines cleared, just like what we're dealing with. Every situation is different, but there are similarities that we need to pick up on. And so my daughter, the economist, said, is there a foreign policy from the United States, and does it have any stated goals? Well, we can talk about the stated goals pretty easily because President Trump campaigned on America First. But we really got to wonder, what does that mean? Well, this is where our original books, these three original books, really help us, because this book right here called The Drift, Stopping America's Slide to Socialism, by President Trump's current Council of Economic Advisors head, Kevin Hassett, he lays it out. And I would strongly recommend my daughter and anybody else with this same question to pick up this book and read it all the way through, because it really does help. Does it answer all your questions? No, because what's happening here, in my mind anyway, the idealist, technology-led world economy that is, I think, coming to a close, and that's a generational thing, and I think Weigel picks up on that very nicely. It's being pushed back on by the realist mindset of China, of Russia, of Iran. And it's being pushed back now because of their pushback by President Trump's realist mindset and his administration's realist mindset. And I will leave you with this question. I won't answer it right now, but I'll leave it with you. I would say, and as I got ready to do this presentation, I thought, is this a good question to ask the audience or not? If you wonder about the realist versus idealist mindset in the here and now, and you think that the idealist global economy mindset is working so well, then why is socialism so strong? Why is there a pushback so hard against the world economy and the way we've devised it ever since World War II? And my argument would be because we forgot about the statecraft, we forgot about the sovereign nation, we forgot about reason. And that's what we did back in the 1980s with this new international economic order and the haves versus the have-nots. What would have happened, in other words, had back in 1981 we went towards more of a realist statecraft, sovereign nation mindset as opposed to the idealistic economic interdependence that President Reagan was back and forth on. That really, at the end of the day, if you look at President Reagan's second term, in my opinion, he wanted to be a realist. He wanted to be like Teddy Roosevelt, like Trump wants to be more like Teddy Roosevelt, because he saw the threats out there. And he was a realist when it came to the Soviet Union, but he also saw that the global economy, or he felt like, and his people felt like, the global economy would be able to tamp down the other more negative socialist mindset. And the Soviet Empire did fall. But why did the Soviet Empire fall? And this is crucial for what we're talking about, with what Tom and I have been talking about this last few weeks. And this is where we're going to jump out a little bit and get over our skis a little bit. My position has been and continues to be that President Reagan, with the help of Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, i.e. Europe, because Great Britain was Europe at that point, and if you really want to think about it, and with the help of the Catholic Church and St. Pope John Paul, those three have got together and they helped take down the Soviet Union. But they couldn't have done that, in my opinion, or probably wouldn't have been able to do that as quickly as they did had it not been for the Soviet Union and China splitting, thanks to the realist realpolitik of President Nixon and some of his policies coming in and driving essentially a wedge that was already starting to, like a fissure was already growing between the Soviet Union and Chinese. But I think the wedge came in with President Nixon's policies towards China specifically. And that split the Chinese and the Soviet Union up enough that gave us a chance with our sovereignty at the forefront to help break down the Soviet Union. What do we have right now, though? We have China and Russia, the former Soviet Union, building a bigger and bigger and bigger empire together. An empire is very realist. An empire is very sovereign. Let's get together because we want to help our own countries. We're not interested in making a beautiful world economy where everybody gets along. I give the idealists a lot of credit, except where it came to the technology side of the equation. I'll get to that in a second. So drifting back from what we saw in the 1980s, late 1980s, and the end of the Soviet Union, and what we thought was a clear victory for Western liberal democracy and that other countries would embrace Western liberal democracy, that didn't happen because we had not taken care of the issue of the haves versus the have-nots. So the policy of foreign political policy and economic policy were not as well adjusted as they needed to be. I'll get into more detail on that in further episodes, but this really answers the question of the morality, and it really answers the question of the liberalism. I'll get more into that in a second, but to answer my daughter's question more bluntly is this idea of liberalism I can attach to the idealist mindset because of what Kevin Hassett says in the book that he just wrote in 2021. This is only 5 years old. This is chapter 10. The title of the chapter is very interesting just in and of itself. Socialism and Trump's place in history. Millions worry about America's drift toward socialism, but what is it exactly? What does this word mean to the millennials who would welcome it? What would it actually be if enacted? And would that really be so bad? I really love how Hassett takes on, and this is how I like to try and do these podcasts, is I really take on the other side to see if they're right or wrong. I'm not going to come in with preconceived notions. I come from a quality control background and an analytical background. I want to know if I'm wrong. I want to know that as much as if I'm right, because that helps me be more right more often, I think. Gallup reports that the largest, this is 2021, reports that the largest response from Americans polled in 1949 when asked about their understanding of socialism defined it as government ownership or control of business. Most Americans today respond that socialism means greater economic equality or the provision of free benefits like health care. For some, it's just synonymous for liberalism, in quotes. So this is extremely beneficial to make us understand that the socialism of today is the liberalism of what we dealt with, or a large part of the liberalism of what we dealt with back in the past. I got a funny anecdotal story for you before I go on to Gilpin. When I was in high school, they had what was called a Buckeye Boy State, and I grew up in the city of the state of Ohio. And every year, the Ohio Republican Party, Democrat Party, would send interested young men, juniors, I think seniors in high school, I think I was a junior, to the state capitol to learn for a week state politics. And you would vie for being a county commissioner, or you'd vie for being a governor. And you got together in a college dorm. In my case, I think we were in Bowling Green. I don't think we went to Columbus, but be that as it may, I think we were at Bowling Green at one of the dorms. And all these high school juniors came from all over the state of Ohio. And it was a real eye-opening experience because I came from a village of 900 people. We were incorporated, but we were a village. And so I remember almost not getting into, and I'm going back and doing this story partly because it's worthwhile to the podcast, but it's also worthwhile for posterity's sake, for my children and grandchildren, because I'll never forget this. As a junior in high school, I had to go in an interview, and at first, I found out that I was not on the list of candidates, and both my brothers had gone to Buckeye Boy State, and my dad was pretty set on me being a candidate, and I'll just leave it at that. And so he called the people in charge, and he said, what are the requirements for being a candidate at Buckeye Boy State? And they said, grade point average, doesn't get in trouble, and something else. Well, I met all those requirements. And he said, my son meets all those requirements. Why isn't he on the list? They said, well, get him on the list right away. It was an oversight. Sorry about that. So I go in and I sit down, and I sit down with these 5 town leaders. And these are like the guy that worked on our furnace and air conditioner. It was like yesterday that I remember this because of the question he asked me. He sat me down, and they sat me down, and each of them asked a question. And the guy that ran the Shriel furnace and air conditioning said to me, would you fight and die for your country? And if you answered yes, you were given the chance to be one of the finalists. If you answered no, I'm guessing you were out. And what my point is for this podcast is that those guys knew communism and socialism like the back of their hand because they fought fascism, they fought socialism, they fought communism back during that time period. And now we're missing that generation. I've always been nervous about what we're going to deal with once those generations are gone. The World War II, the Korean generation, even the Vietnam generation, in having to deal with, and especially the Vietnam generation, that they had to deal with when they came back home. And so my point in this is, if you ask me, and Tom has asked me this in the past, I think, what do you think the outcome will be between the U.S. and China, or the New East and the New West, to bring it back to the podcast? My outcome has been founded upon that, in part, that because the Soviet Union, i.e. Russia and China, are stronger now, and because we have this lost generation of American foreign policy and understanding of realism versus idealism, we're going to probably have to watch this go down the road. In other words, I think as we get ready for the Trump-Xi summit in mid-May, number one is, will it happen if the Strait of Hormuz is still closed? I think there's a 50-50 chance now that it's going to happen. And it probably goes lower than that if we keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. And even if the summit happens, will China really want to, or Russia and the New East really want to back down? I don't think they will, because this is a different situation, but with the same circumstances or similar circumstances that we had back in the 1980s. And this is a perfect time to talk about what Gilpin says. A couple of quick thoughts about him. We're going to talk about the statecraft a little bit more and kind of button up some of what I've just been talking about. Major difference between political realism and much contemporary theorizing. This was written back in the early 1980s. Remember this. This is like it's today. You could read it like it was today. Theorizing about international relations is that realism assumes the continuity of statecraft. Realism is based on practices of states, and it seeks to understand how states have always behaved and presumably will always behave. That rationality, that reason in political theorizing. It does not believe that the condition of anarchy can be transcended except through a universal imperium, and thus it contrasts with a powerful strain in contemporary thinking. The advance of technology may open up opportunities for mutual benefit, but it also increases the power available for political struggle. The advance of human reason and understanding will not end this power struggle, but it does make it possible a more enlightened understanding and pursuit of national self-interest. Notice what Gilpin does here. He says, hey, you've got technology, you've got the economics, but if you don't take care of the haves versus have-nots and the wealth distribution of globalization, technology can work against you. And in fact, that's probably what we saw, is the idealists embraced technology, thought that we could get together and use technology and become more economically interdependent with one another. We had morality on our side. The liberalism of Western democracy would carry us through to the end of the day, but it didn't work because we left out statecraft. We left out statecraft, and we can't leave out statecraft again. So if you are anti-President Trump right now and his policies, consider statecraft. If you are anti-President Trump's policies because of what he says on Truth Social, totally understand. This is what we're going to have to do, I think, in the next 6 months to 2 years, between now and the next presidential election, as a country and in international affairs and understanding the global politics, is separate out the words versus the policy. And that's what I'm trying to do on this podcast. So the last thing we'll talk about on the vocabulary side is the beggar thy neighbor. What's that mean? Well, international affairs, as we've designed it, being so heavily reliant upon this economic interdependence and this Western liberal ideal, has also brought with it that when things don't go well, what do? Well, this is what's happened, and this is what happened back in the 80s. We come in and we say, our country, we forgot about the statecraft and the sovereignty of our nation. Our country is doing poorly economically because we aren't capturing as much from globalization, or we are the US, or we're Great Britain, or we're China, and we're going through a recession. What do? We cut our interest rates, we depreciate our currency, we increase our exports at the expense of the other countries. That's beggar thy neighbor. We take down our abilities to keep imports high and exports low or more balanced. We bring down the wall so the exports can flow out, but that's going to come at the expense of somebody. And if you had to ask me what is the biggest thing we have to solve in order to get back to this new international economic outlook or organization, is we've got to solve the beggar thy neighbor problem. And I don't think we can do that with a world institution. I just don't think we can. Tom, do you have any questions at this point?
Yeah, can you go more into what you mentioned about interest rates and kind of fleshing that out in terms of what you see coming next for the interest rates?
Yeah, great point. I'll do that here in a second. I'm going to finish up this last quote. This is coming from Gilpin again. And this is the end of his book before his epilogue. And this, again, back 1981 time period. All there, and he's talking about idealism and what we've been going through, not necessarily realism. He's talking about the current economic thought back then, which was, as I talked about before, more idealistic in its political thought. Although there are important elements of truth in all these theses discussed in this chapter, none of them leads to the conclusion that mankind has transcended the fundamental nature of international relations. World politics is still characterized by the struggle of political entities for power, prestige, and wealth in a condition of global anarchy. Nuclear weapons have not made the resort to force irrelevant. Economic interdependence does not guarantee that cooperation will triumph over conflict. A global community of common values and outlook has yet to displace international anarchy. I think that really sums up where we're at today, and I think we can see that very easily, and I don't have to belabor that point. So we're going to stop on that unless there are any other questions for Tom, and talk more about what's happening real time here. Tom asked a very poignant question. Tom and I never talk about this podcast before we go on because we want it to be as organic and as fun as possible. But he hit on the nose what I'm dealing with in commodities right now. As a commodity analyst, I have to think about this beggar thy neighbor mindset because it's all about currencies, right? I hate when people say right. I'll never do that again to you. If I do, I'll pay you $5, Tom. It's a new thing. Remember when we started on our podcast, I said I've got certain ways of doing things. I'm a certain kind of guy. People that say da-da-da-da-da, right? It's like, don't try and convince me with saying right at the end of your question or statement. Just tell me what you really think and then we'll talk about it. So I broke my own rule. Commodity analyst has to look at currencies. What we've seen here is, okay, so let's make green the US dollar. And let's say before, I don't know the exact time period this happened, but I'm going to guess it was 2018 or to 2020. We became a net exporter of crude oil on a regular basis. Before that time period, we were a net importer. And so before 2018, 2020, if the US dollar was going up, Next one we're going to make is WTI crude oil. Crude oil was going down. And U.S. Treasuries would typically try and follow the U.S. dollar because it takes U.S. dollars to buy U.S. Treasuries. So we'll say they were going up as well, but maybe not as much. So the U.S. Treasuries were a safe haven. U.S. dollar was a safe haven. WTI was the world demand along with copper. What we've seen since 2020, roughly, is the U.S. dollar, say it's gone up like that. Crude oil, because we're a net exporter, and this is the Bank of International Settlements, did a paper on this. I'd recommend, don't take my word for it. They've actually started to move together. Makes it a lot harder for commodity analysts because you've gone 25 years thinking that WTI goes down, dollar goes the opposite direction. Where's the linkage between those two other than import, export? Okay, so if the US dollar is going up, that's deflationary to the world. Go back to the import-export mindset. US dollar is going down, that's inflationary. If the crude oil market is going higher, that should be inflationary. So, both of these two being inflationary, you should see the dollar go down and the crude go up, move in opposite directions. We don't have that anymore, so it's a lot more confusing. So what I'm doing right now is I'm coming in and looking at the gold and the U.S. Treasuries more. And what we've seen in the gold, obviously, has been this straight up move like that. That's been accompanied with a straight down move in the dollar. And that goes back to the tariffs and the fear. That's what I like, is this linkage of the opposite, this diverging price action. And it's been very consistent, so I'm still on board with that. But now what we're seeing, and they've been writing about this in the metals markets, gold has started to go down and the dollar has started to go up because U.S. Treasuries have started to go down. Why have U.S. Treasuries started to go down? Because the WTI crude has been going up. Whoops, I already did that. Yeah, the WTI. Okay, so I got it covered. Okay, so the gold is one thing to watch, but why is the WTI going up and the interest and the U.S. Treasuries are going down? Because, in my opinion, the WTI traders taking the crude oil higher tells the bond trader the Fed's got to raise rates. We're putting into the market right now this idea that as the WTI goes up, the bonds have to go lower to build inflation into the market. But when you have higher yields and higher interest rates in the Treasury market, even if the WTI is going up, do investors want to jump into commodities? Probably not, because it's going to cost more on margin. It's going to be more risk. And usually the riskier asset players want a flat or higher Treasury market to play in the riskier commodity assets. That's the working model that I'm under right now, Tom. And I think the issue is, and I've been asked a lot about this, what's going to happen with the gold market? And I'm not going to give that out for free. I'm going to ask you to go to globalcomresearch.com and ask for a 2-week free trial, and then we can talk one-on-one. I'm not doing that to try and get money from you. I'm doing that to cover me with the compliance and cover me with what I can and cannot tell you when it comes to a blog like this. It's just that simple. The compliance is tight enough that I don't want to put myself out on a limb. I don't want you to risk anything that you can't afford risking. I'll leave it at that. Go ahead, Tom. You have any follow-up?
This might be a little outside of the scope of the presentation today, but is this type of action in the market kind of a predictable pattern that we see every time we shift between realist and idealist, or is, since it's happened before in history, or is that something that's too far away to really determine a pattern?
No, it's a great question. I will take it in two directions. We'll first talk about, and I don't have a stockbroker's license. I only have a commodity license, so I'm only talking about equity futures, like the S&P 500 futures. So don't go equity on me in terms of this. But when you look at the S&P 500 and you ask the question Tom just asked, and you look at 130 to 140 million, 130 to 140 dollar per barrel crude oil in the real market in the North Sea of England off of the Brent futures, that cash spot crude, it dipped to like 111, I think, this week, but it's back up to 130. That's back towards the March highs. And this is a really key point that Tom, through his question, I can hit on that I really wanted to address. Do you remember, I think it was last time I talked about the genie in the bottle? I said the genie's out of the bottle about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. And then I said, if this continues on, because I think it was on one of Tom's questions about natural gas versus crude oil and whether we could put that genie back in the bottle. I said, if this keeps going on, the bottle's going to get broken. And I think you can go back and find that on one of the podcasts. Guess what the head of the international agency said this week? The vase is broken in the Middle East energy market. It's almost the exact same type of mindset that I have right now is what he has right now. We're getting to a point where I think some of the statistics I saw, I think it was in an Economist article, and I'll get back, don't worry, I'm talking about the S&P still, but I think in an Economist article, 50 days, 500 million barrels lost. So you're talking about 10 million a day. There was a commodity conference in Europe last week. A couple big commodity people said that they think we're up to 1 billion barrels lost if you include infrastructure lost. Another big thing that's been out is that Asia has cut, I believe it's 3% of their refining. Excuse me. 3 billion, glad I looked, 3 billion barrels, that's 10% of their refining capacity. In May, there's expectations that's going to go to 5 million, and in July, that could be 10 million barrels per day. That's what we mean by the bottle's broken. So we're talking about something truly, honestly historic. We're talking about something that we just made a new record high in the stock market. I've never known or been around this level of negative supply shock in the energy market worldwide and seen the equity markets do what they're doing right now. So I can't say that there is anything historically that would come close to what we're dealing with. I'll go back and check on that, Tom, and give you an update next time we do a podcast, but I think I've said this before, I'm very, very nervous about a major correction in the S&P 500 and the equities markets. And I think this goes back to the crude oil market. One of the things that I've talked about, and so far it's really working well, so please keep this in mind. We were at about 80.50, and on March 15th, I said that's our new, I think that's my analysis would suggest, based upon some of this data now coming in, that's our new support level. So after March 15th, it's going to be hard to go below 80.50. After April 15th, it's going to be, I add $15 every 30 days. So after April 15th, it's going to be hard to go below, that'd be 95.50 plus 15. I'm now going out to May 15, and that's going to be 105.50. All right, 110. 95 and 15 is 110. So about every 30 days, I'm going to say the new support level is jumping 15 bucks a barrel. How in the world can we get an S&P 500 market to get and sustain new record highs if we sustain a $110 barrel WTI crude oil market when we're shipping a bunch now over to Asia? And so that huge price increase at Brent, and this is the same for natural gas, huge price discount for WTI. I see those two coming together through the ARB, the arbitrage, over the course of the next few months, because Asia will and Europe will just keep coming over to the United States for the cheaper. It'll make it worthwhile because it's so high in shipping and in transportation costs. I did hear, though, I think it was just this past week, oil tanker going through the Panama Canal, I believe was the shipping on it was $4 million, and I believe, don't hold me to these numbers, it was like $200,000 or $300,000 before the war. So it's gonna get real fast, and this is what we're talking about. With the genie's long gone out of the bottle, the bottle's broken, or if you want to use the IEA's terms, we're talking about the vase is broken. And this goes back to the U.S.-China relationship. This goes back to the New East, New West. This goes back to the President Trump realist mindset. His people know what this is going to do to the market. I'm convinced of that. I really am. But they, I think, feel like this is a generational opportunity to push back from the third great power. And I'll end it today with this thought. And this is not and we can pick up on this next time, but this is a thought. Great Britain, the United States, China. Is it China's turn? And I think China and the New East think it is. And I think that's exactly where we're at with what we're being pushing back on in the United States. But it's a very tough game being energy markets. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week, everybody.